Story 1. The Watcher by the Lake. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. I had planned a solo camping trip to a secluded lake deep within the national park. The place was known for its beauty, its crystal clear water, and the serenity of its surroundings. What it wasn't known for, however, was being a place of fear. That part I discovered on my own. I arrived at the lake late in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, and the reflection on the water was breathtaking. I pitched my tent a few feet from the shoreline, eager to settle in for a relaxing night of solitude. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of the water and the rustling of leaves in the wind. As the night deepened, the forest around me grew darker and quieter. The peaceful chirping of birds gave way to the distant croaks of frogs and the occasional hoot of an owl. I sat by the fire, enjoying the calm, when something changed. The air grew still to still. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. That's when I saw it movement near the tree line on the far side of the lake. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. But as I squinted through the darkness, I realized the shape was all wrong. It was tall, much too tall to be a deer, and its movements were slow and deliberate. I leaned forward, trying to get a better look, but the flickering light from my fire only illuminated a small area. The figure stopped at the edge of the trees, just far enough away that I couldn't make out any details. It stood there, completely still, watching me. My heart began to race, but I told myself it was probably just another camper or a hiker passing through. I waved, but the figure didn't respond. It didn't move. It just stood there. I decided to ignore it, hoping that whoever or whatever it was would lose interest and leave. I poked at the fire, trying to focus on the warmth and light, but my eyes kept drifting back to the spot where the figure stood. It hadn't moved. Minutes passed, then an hour. The figure remained, a silent sentinel at the edge of the trees. The fire began to die down, and I knew I needed to gather more wood if I wanted to keep it going through the night. I stood up, my legs shaky, and grabbed my flashlight. I shined it toward the tree line, but the beam wasn't strong enough to reach the figure. Still, I could see the faint outline of it, standing there like a shadow. I gathered some wood from around my campsite, my every sense on high alert. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, like a pressure bearing down on me from all sides. I returned to the fire and stoked it back to life, the flames dancing higher, but the figure remained unmoving. I debated what to do next. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, but I was miles away from my car, and hiking through the woods at night didn't seem like a better option. I decided to wait it out, hoping that dawn would bring some clarity and safety. Around midnight, I heard a low guttural sound, like a growl, but deeper, more primal. It came from the direction of the figure. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure still hadn't moved, but the sound echoed across the lake, chilling me to the bone. I grabbed my phone, but of course, there was no signal. I was completely alone. I shined the flashlight toward the figure again, and for the first time, it moved. Slowly, it stepped out from the tree line, its long, lanky limbs moving in a way that was almost unnatural. It didn't seem to walk so much as glide across the ground, heading toward the lake. Panic surged through me. I backed up, retreating closer to the fire, as if its warmth could protect me from whatever this thing was. The figure stopped at the edge of the water, standing perfectly still once again. Its head tilted slightly, as if it was watching me, studying me. The growling stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. And then, without warning, the figure began to walk around the edge of the lake, heading toward my campsite. My blood ran cold as I realized it was coming for me. I grabbed my pack and threw it over my shoulder, my mind racing. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. I quickly doused the fire, plunging the campsite into darkness. My flashlight flickered as I tried to make my way through the trees, my footsteps crunching on the leaves and twigs beneath me. The sound of the figure's footsteps echoed behind me, getting closer with every second. I didn't dare look back. I ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest, the cold air stinging my lungs. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches scratching at my arms and face. The footsteps were getting louder. I ran deeper into the forest, not knowing where I was going, only that I needed to get away. My legs burned with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop. The footsteps were almost on top of me now, and the low growling had returned, sending waves of fear through my body. I skidded to a halt, my breathing ragged as I listened. The forest was silent again, the only sound my own panicked breaths. I slowly turned around, shining the flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing there. No figure, no growling, just the empty, oppressive silence of the forest. I didn't waste any time. I kept running, pushing myself to keep going until I finally reached the road where I had parked my car. I jumped in, locking the doors behind me, and sped out of there as fast as I could. I haven't been back to that lake since, and I don't plan to. Whatever was out there that night, it wasn't human, and it was watching me. Story 2. The Hiker's Shadow. It was late October, and I had decided to take one last hike before the winter set in. There was a trail deep in the forest I had been meaning to explore for months, one that wound through a remote and heavily wooded area. The locals warned me that it was easy to get lost there, especially with the shorter daylight hours, but I shrugged it off. I was an experienced hiker, and the isolation was part of the appeal. I wanted to enjoy the solitude and the raw beauty of nature before the snow began to fall. I set off early in the morning, the air cold and crisp, my breath forming small clouds as I hiked through the woods. The trail was beautiful, with leaves crunching under my boots and towering trees, creating a canopy of red and gold above me. I felt a deep sense of peace, the kind that comes from being far away from the noise and chaos of civilization. It was just me, the forest, and the quiet. By midday, I reached a rocky outcrop that offered a stunning view of the valley below. I sat there for a while, eating my lunch and taking in the scenery. The sun was high in the sky, casting long beams of light through the trees, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. But that sense of peace didn't last. After resting for a bit, I packed up and continued down the trail. As I walked, I noticed something strange. The deeper I went into the forest, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves faded away, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. It was unsettling. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. I tried to shake off the growing sense of unease, telling myself it was nothing. But as I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. Standing in the middle of the path, about 100 yards ahead, was a figure. At first, I thought it was another hiker, but something was off. The figure was standing unnaturally still, facing away from me. They didn't seem to notice my approach, didn't turn or move. I called out, "Hey," hoping to get their attention. My voice echoed strangely in the silence, but the figure didn't respond. They just stood there like a statue. As I got closer, I felt a chill run down my spine. The figure was tall, much taller than any person should be. Its proportions were wrong, its arms too long, its body unnaturally thin. My instincts screamed at me to turn around and leave, but curiosity got the better of me. I slowed my pace, my eyes locked on the figure. When I was about 50 feet away, I stopped. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. Still no response. The figure remained completely motionless, as if frozen in place. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something wasn't right. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when the figure moved. Slowly, it began to turn, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. As it turned to face me, I felt my blood run cold. It didn't have a face. Where its features should have been, there was only a blank, smooth surface, like a mask with no eyes, no mouth, nothing. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure stood there, staring at me with its featureless face. It took a step forward, its long arms hanging limply at its sides, its legs moving with an unnatural stiffness. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. The figure took another step, then another, each one bringing it closer to me. The air around me seemed to thicken, the silence pressing against my ears. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. All I could do was watch as this thing slowly, methodically, closed the distance between us. And then it stopped. It was only a few feet away now, close enough that I could see the strange texture of its skin or whatever it was made of. It wasn't flesh. It was too smooth, too pale, almost translucent. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if studying me, but I couldn't tell what it was thinking. I couldn't even tell if it was alive. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. I had planned a solo camping trip to a secluded lake deep within the national park. The place was known for its beauty, its crystal clear water, and the serenity of its surroundings. What it wasn't known for, however, was being a place of fear. That part I discovered on my own. Finally, my body responded. I took a step back, then another, my eyes never leaving the figure. It didn't follow. It just stood there, watching, its head still tilted to the side. I turned and began to walk, slowly at first, then faster. My footsteps were loud in the eerie silence, and every step felt like a struggle. I didn't dare look back. I walked for what felt like hours, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I had seen. The trail ahead seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in around me. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the ground, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. I knew I had to get out of the woods before dark. As I reached a familiar part of the trail, I began to feel a sense of relief. The car wasn't far now. I could make it. But then I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint at first, barely audible over the sound of my own breathing, but they were there behind me. I stopped, my heart racing, and listened. The footsteps stopped too. I turned slowly, my hands trembling, my eyes scanning the trees. There was nothing. No figure, no movement, just the darkening forest. I took a deep breath and continued walking, picking up the pace. The footsteps resumed, matching my every step. Panic set in. I started to run, my legs burning as I sprinted down the trail. The footsteps behind me grew louder, faster, as if whatever was following me was getting closer. I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I could think about was getting to my car, getting away from whatever this thing was. The trail blurred as I ran, my lungs screaming for air, my heart pounding in my ears. The footsteps were right behind me now, so close I could almost feel the figure's presence. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the footsteps stopped. I skidded to a halt, gasping for breath, and turned around. There was nothing. The trail was empty, the forest silent once again. I stood there for a moment, trembling, before turning and running the rest of the way to my car. I never went back to that trail. I don't know what that figure was, or why it followed me, but I know I'll never forget the feeling of those footsteps behind me, the weight of its presence closing in. Whatever it wasn't human, and it was watching me. Story 3. The Lurker in the Canyon. I had always been drawn to the beauty of the desert. Its vast open spaces and towering rock formations made it feel like a world of its own, untouched by time. That's why, when I had the opportunity to go on a solo camping trip to a remote canyon I'd heard about, I jumped at the chance. It was a place few people ever ventured, far from the beaten path, and that suited me just fine. I arrived at the canyon just as the sun was beginning to set. The towering red cliffs cast long shadows across the desert floor, and the sky was painted with brilliant shades of orange and pink. I set up camp near the base of one of the cliffs, a perfect spot sheltered from the wind. The air was cool, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of wind through the sparse desert vegetation. As night fell, the temperature dropped quickly. I lit a small fire, warming my hands as I stared up at the stars. Out here, the sky was so clear you could see every star, every constellation, twinkling in the blackness above. It was peaceful, almost otherworldly. I felt like I was the only person in the world. But that feeling didn't last long. It must have been around midnight when I first noticed it, a sound, faint but distinct, echoing off the canyon walls. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't. It was a slow, deliberate tapping, like something knocking against the rocks. I sat up, straining to listen. The fire crackled softly, the only other sound in the stillness of the night. The tapping continued, rhythmic and unsettling, coming from somewhere deep within the canyon. My mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe it was a loose rock falling, or some kind of animal moving through the canyon. But the pattern was too deliberate, too unnatural. I stood up, grabbing my flashlight, and shined it toward the cliffs. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the jagged rocks and the twisted shapes of desert plants. But there was nothing. The sound had stopped. I took a deep breath, telling myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me in the isolation of the desert. I sat back down by the fire, trying to shake off the unease. But the feeling of being watched lingered, hanging in the air like a weight. I decided to call it a night. I doused the fire and crawled into my sleeping bag, pulling it tightly around me to block out the cold. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring up at the stars, my mind still fixated on the strange noise. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the fire had long since died out, and the canyon was bathed in darkness. My heart was pounding, though I wasn't sure why. It wasn't a noise that had woken me, but a feeling, an overwhelming sense of dread, like something terrible was about to happen. I lay there, perfectly still, listening to the silence. And then I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. The same rhythmic knocking, this time closer, echoing off the canyon walls. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was coming from the direction of the cliffs. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands shaking, and slowly unzipped the tent. I shined the light toward the cliffs, and my blood ran cold. Standing at the base of the cliff, no more than 50 feet away, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its outline barely visible in the weak beam of my flashlight. At first, I thought it was another camper or hiker, but as I focused on it, I realized there was something wrong. The figure wasn't moving. It was just standing there, perfectly still, facing the cliff, its head tilted down as if staring at the ground. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched, waiting for it to do something, anything. But it didn't move. I called out, "Hello," my voice cracking in the stillness. No response. The figure remained motionless, its shadow stretching long across the desert floor. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I stepped out of the tent, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and took a few cautious steps forward. "Hey," I called again, louder this time. Still nothing. The figure didn't acknowledge me, didn't react in any way. It was like it didn't even know I was there. I stopped about 20 feet from the figure, my heart racing. My instincts were screaming at me to turn around, to get back in the tent and stay hidden. But something about the figure was pulling me in, a morbid curiosity driving me to understand what I was seeing. Suddenly, the figure moved. It wasn't a slow, natural movement. It jerked violently, its head snapping upward to face the cliff, then to the side, as if it was looking for something. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure's movements were sharp and erratic, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. And then it turned toward me. My flashlight flickered, casting the figure's face into shadow, but I could see enough. It wasn't human. Its skin was pale and stretched too tightly over its gaunt frame, its eyes hollow and dark. It didn't have a mouth, just a blank, featureless space where its mouth should have been. I stumbled back, my heart slamming against my ribs. The figure began to move toward me, its long, bony arms reaching out as it shuffled across the desert floor. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, like it was being pulled forward by some unseen force. I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get away. My legs burned as I sprinted across the desert, the sound of the figure's footsteps echoing behind me, getting closer with every step. I could feel it closing in on me, feel the weight of its presence bearing down on me. My flashlight flickered again, the beam cutting in and out as I ran. In the moments of darkness, I could hear the figure's raspy breathing, feel the cold air against my skin as it reached for me. Somehow, I made it back to my campsite. I grabbed my keys, threw my gear into the back of my car, and sped off into the night, not stopping until I was miles away from the canyon. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if it was still following me. To this day, I don't know what that thing was. But I've never been back to that canyon, and I never will. Whatever I saw that night wasn't human, and it was watching me. Hey there, it's Mr. Night Horror. If you enjoyed this eerie journey and want to dive deeper into the shadows with us, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back with more spine-chilling tales tomorrow. Stay haunted.